The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Many economists consider Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations one of the major foundational texts of their discipline. Writing in 1776, Smith argues that free markets are the best institution for cultivating a nation's wealth. Free markets harness the power of rational self-interest to incentivize the production of useful goods while efficiently distributing surplus wealth. Because of this, Smith makes a case against heavy-handed market regulations that interfere with the natural wealth-generating processes of uninhibited markets. Adam Smith was a philosopher who lived in 18th-century Scotland. At the time, the field of economics existed primarily as a hobby for philosophers in other disciplines. Smith's theories helped lay the groundwork for the development of economics into an established field of study. Though radical in their time, many of Smith's ideas have informed economic policies of nations all over the world. In this guide, we'll explore Smith's arguments by first discussing how markets work and some of the factors that influence them. We'll explain the benefits of workforce specialization, the purposes of money, and the natural costs of goods. Then, we'll cover the role of capital in developing a nation's economy. Finally, we'll consider the role of government, including regulations, public spending, and revenue. Throughout this guide, we'll compare Smith's ideas to contemporary economics, while shedding light on his arguments by providing historical context. Short-form note: in organizing this guide, we've chosen to highlight the core mechanics of Smith's macroeconomic theory for contemporary readers, modernizing terms when applicable and focusing less on Smith's analysis of specific market conditions and economic policies of the 18th century. However, we've still generalized his critiques to provide readers with a clear sense of the types of policies Smith opposed and his arguments against them. Part 1. How Nations Produce Wealth. Smith states that a nation's wealth is determined by the ratio of what it produces to what it consumes. Wealthy nations are able to satisfy all their citizens' needs, either by producing the goods those citizens consume or by producing goods for export to other countries that can be exchanged for goods that are consumed at home. On the other hand, poor nations are unable to satisfy the needs of their citizens, either because they don't produce enough goods directly to meet their citizens' consumption needs or because they don't export enough to other countries to receive sufficient goods for home consumption in exchange. Throughout his book, Smith argues that the individual pursuit of self-interest maximizes a nation's capacity to produce wealth. In this section, we'll define this concept, explain how it encourages the specialization of labor, and how this leads to greater prosperity in a large market-based system. How self-interest promotes wealth production. Smith states that workers produce the goods that increase a nation's wealth out of a desire for personal gain. Because they can make the most money for themselves by creating things that others want to use and buy, workers will naturally be drawn to create the goods that are most useful and desirable to others. Furthermore, self-interest will also direct workers to produce more goods at a higher quality because the more and better goods they make, the more they earn selling them at market. Common sense and the Scottish Enlightenment. Smith's economic theories were heavily influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment, an intellectual movement in which he was a major figure. This movement also included philosophers like David Hume, George Campbell, and Francis Hutcheson, Smith's teacher. The Scottish Enlightenment placed a heavy emphasis on common sense and the wisdom of ordinary people in making the right choices for their lives. These philosophers understood common sense as the ability to perceive and discern truth that is common to all and independent from reason or knowledge. The philosopher James Beattie described it as that power of the mind which perceives truth or commands belief, not by progressive argumentation, but by an instantaneous, instinctive, and irresistible impulse, derived neither from education nor from habit, but from nature. These ideas influenced Smith's economic philosophy, as he asserts that governments ought to trust ordinary people's instincts for personal gain and ability to discern their own interests as the guiding force in the economy. This will yield more prosperity than a reason-based government program to grow the economy by setting prices and prioritizing some industries over others. The specialization of labor. Smith maintains that self-interest also leads to wealth production because it encourages the specialization of labor. Specialization of labor is the practice of dividing one complicated task done by one worker into a series of smaller, simpler tasks done by multiple workers. For example, if you're making bread without specializing, one worker will grow the wheat, grind it into flour, and then use it to make the loaf. With the specialization of labor, you'll have a farmer who specializes in growing wheat, a miller who specializes in grinding flour, and a baker who specializes in making bread. Specialization allows for much greater productivity overall. The same number of workers will produce far more loaves of bread if they specialize than if each worker completes the entire job. Smith provides 3 reasons why specialization increases productivity. The more a worker performs a task, the more skilled they will become at it. A highly skilled worker will complete the task even faster, allowing for more productivity overall. A specialized worker saves time by not switching between tasks. Different stages of tasks may require the worker to use different tools or work in different locations. This means it takes time to switch from one task to another, time that could have been spent working. A specialized worker will be more likely to come up with more efficient ways of completing a task. If someone spends all of their time concentrating on one task, they will understand the task better than anyone else. This will help them come up with new tools, methods, or machines that allow them to complete the task more efficiently. Short-form note. Historians and archaeologists have supported Smith's claims about specialization increasing productivity, finding that the specialization of labor played an important role in developing the earliest civilizations during the Neolithic period. Once irrigation and the domestication of cereals created a surplus of food, workers formerly employed in food production could begin specializing in pottery, brickmaking, metallurgy, textiles, baskets, and other niche occupations that were unsupportable in hunter-gatherer societies. Large markets enable specialization. Smith explains that a worker's ability to specialize is determined by the size of the market in which they participate. The larger the market, the more workers can specialize. The smaller the market, the less they can specialize. This is because a worker's ability to specialize is dependent on the quantity of raw materials available for purchase, as well as the quantity of customers to whom they can sell their goods. The more customers willing to buy a particular good, the more time and effort a worker can afford to invest in creating that good without having to switch tasks and make something else. This allows them to specialize in making that good more efficiently. For example, let's say you make condiments and you want to specialize in mustard. Your ability to spend all day making jars of mustard is limited by the number of people in your town who want to buy them. Once you've sold all the jars of mustard you can, you'll need to switch to something else, like mayonnaise or ketchup, or you'll have piles of unsellable mustard. However, in a big enough town, you're less likely to run out of people who buy mustard, and you can specialize in making mustard all day, every day. Smith suggests that this is why the most economically developed societies usually have access to ports, canals, and other trading routes. They develop more advanced economies because their workers participate in larger markets and can therefore afford to specialize more. Short-form note. In addition to higher degrees of specialization, economists have connected market size to increased rates of competition and innovation. Larger markets with more participants will require sellers to outcompete and keep up with their rivals. This not only leads to more innovation, but also to faster widespread adoption of new technologies such as steam engines or assembly lines because companies don't want to fall behind. Part 2. How markets exchange wealth. In a capitalist society, everyone's a merchant. Smith contends that you cannot meet your needs without purchasing goods produced by others. Therefore, everyone must exchange value for value, wealth for wealth. Workers sell their labor in exchange for wages just as merchants sell goods in exchange for profits. But what are we really exchanging, and how do we do so? In this section, we will cover Smith's theories on what markets exchange and how they're able to facilitate this exchange. What do markets exchange? Markets exchange the value of labor. Smith explains that the value of every good is derived from the work people put into producing it. For example, when you buy a block of cheese at a grocery store, You are paying for the work of the farmers who raised and milked the cows, the farmers who raised feed for the cows, the dairy processors who turned the milk into cheese, the truck drivers who shipped the cheese to your grocery store, the store clerks who keep the shop open, the workers in the energy sector providing electricity for every step of the process, and so on. Therefore, when you trade your labor for wages and then spend those wages on goods, you're really exchanging your labor for the labor of others. You gain wealth by contributing labor to society, and your wealth gives you the power to command labor from others. The labor theory of value. Smith maintained that labor was the foundation of all economic value and thus backed the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value states that the value of a commodity can be objectively measured by the amount of labor required to produce it. However, this idea has since become controversial and is no longer considered part of mainstream economic thought. Here we'll review some of the criticisms of this theory as well as how Smith's defenders respond. Critics of the labor theory of value mainly assert that it can't be used to accurately understand or predict pricing. They point out that a good that takes twice as much work doesn't necessarily cost twice as much money, and it's possible to expend a lot of work on making something nobody wants to buy. Since Smith's time, a new theory called subjectivism has maintained that the real value of a good lies in its desirability, in consumers' subjective evaluation of its worth. However, the labor theory of value still has its supporters. Marxists have taken up the idea to contend that workers produce the real value in society, and therefore capitalists are exploiting them by taking value without contributing labor themselves. Meanwhile, Smith's defenders argue that the critiques of his labor theory of value misconstrue his position. They maintain that Smith doesn't use labor as an objective measure for comparing prices, but that he views it more as an abstract claim about the nature of wealth itself. Smith states that labor is the first price by which goods are purchased from nature, and so he sees it as the origin of all wealth. How do markets exchange? Smith asserts that markets can only exchange labor if there's a shared medium of exchange. This is because there's a problem with exchanging labor for labor. Not everyone's work produces something everyone else wants. If you make nails, you can only buy a pair of socks if you can find someone selling socks who also wants nails. However, if you have a shared medium of exchange, such as a currency, then you can sell your nails to anyone who wants to buy them. Then you can take the currency and use it to buy socks. The person selling socks can then take the money and use it to purchase whatever they want in exchange for their labor. This allows for a much smoother and more efficient functioning of markets. Short-form note: economists have found that a shared medium of exchange, money, also allows for greater decentralization of markets. If traders needed to find a perfect match each time they traded, a double coincidence of wants in economic terms, this would force traders into large, centralized marketplaces where they could increase the odds of finding that rare match. This would also reduce the diversity of goods people could trade, as each trader would need to find the commodities others want most to increase the likelihood of finding that match. A shared medium of exchange allows for markets to spread out geographically and accommodate a greater diversity of niches. Part 3. How markets regulate themselves. Smith argues that free markets are the most efficient way of directing the production and exchange of goods to grow a nation's wealth, and thereby enable the specialization of labor. To understand how markets are able to do this, we'll first take a look at two sides of a mutually reinforcing system: how market conditions influence the price of goods, and how prices regulate market behavior. Then we'll take a look at the forces behind the scenes that determine the natural prices of goods in a balanced and competitive market. How markets regulate price. The ratio between supply and demand regulates the price of any good. The supply is the amount of a good sellers are bringing to market. The demand is the amount of a good customers want to buy. Smith explains that if demand is higher than supply, the customers will have to compete with each other. They will compete by offering more money for the same good than the next customer, thus driving up the price. However, if supply outweighs demand, then the sellers will have to compete with each other by lowering prices. The role of market competition. For the supply and demand system to work, sellers must compete with other sellers, and buyers must compete with other buyers. Therefore, there are two market structures that must be avoided to keep this system in balance: monopolies and monopsonies. A monopoly occurs when markets are dominated by a single seller who doesn't have to compete. This allows the seller to raise prices to the highest that customers are willing and able to pay. A monopsony occurs when markets are dominated by a single buyer. This sometimes happens in labor markets where one company employs most of the workforce in a small town. There are differing theories on whether governments should take an active role in breaking up monopolies or monopsonies to maintain competitive markets. Nations have a vested interest in the benefits of market competition and are therefore justified in interfering to prevent consolidation. Others fear that this may be a form of manipulation that prevents markets from functioning independently. They contend that consolidation sometimes happens as a result of preference for a particular company. How prices regulate markets. The fluctuation of price regulates markets to naturally create balance between suppliers and customers. Smith states that as long as there is free competition and buyers and sellers pursue their own self-interests, the supply of goods will naturally balance itself out to meet the demand for those goods. To understand this process, we need to consider how it plays out over time. If demand for a good outweighs supply of that good, customers will bid against each other, driving up the price of the good. Guided by their economic self-interest, the sellers will have a strong incentive to bring more of that good to market to take advantage of these high prices. However, if in doing so the sellers then bring more of the good to market than customers want to buy, the sellers will then have to sell the good for less money to compete with other sellers' prices. Guided by self-interest, sellers will naturally bring less of that good to market until supply meets demand. This allows market systems to efficiently balance the production of goods to their demand. Short-form note: economists have found that the process of prices regulating markets works most efficiently when the participants have access to accurate information about pricing. If customers don't have accurate information about the prices offered by competing sellers, they won't be able to compare prices as easily and force sellers into competition with each other. Furthermore, sellers who have more information about their competitors' prices will have an advantage over those who have less information. In reality, it's impossible for everyone to have perfect information all the time, but markets work more efficiently when participants have accurate and up-to-date information informing their decisions. Part 4. The natural price of goods. When supply and demand are in equilibrium, goods will be sold for their natural price. Smith explains that the natural price is the cost of bringing a good to market. It includes the costs of production along with the typical profit margins for each step of the process. The natural price is like the center of gravity around which the market prices fluctuate. If a customer gets a good or bad deal on a purchase, it is a good or bad deal in relation to the natural price. Smith argues that the natural price of a good is determined by the costs of its production. A business can only continue bringing goods to market if it's able to sell them for more than their cost of production. Otherwise, they'll simply go bankrupt. Therefore, the natural price of a good will change in accordance with changes in any of the costs of production. Smith identifies three main costs that determine a good's natural price: wages, rent, and capital. Cost number 1. Wages and labor markets. The price of any good includes the wages of the workers who produced it. Businesses must pay their workers, who are also pursuing their own self-interest and therefore wouldn't work for free. Thus, the wages of workers involved in every step of the process are going to be included in the natural price. Smith identifies two factors that determine the cost of wages: labor markets and workers' living conditions. 1. Labor markets. To understand what raises or lowers the cost of wages, we need to look at labor markets. The principle of individual self-interest also governs labor markets, much like it governs markets for goods. Labor markets consist of a seller, the worker, trying to sell their labor for the highest price, and a buyer, the employer, trying to buy labor for the lowest price. The same principles of supply and demand apply. Anything that reduces the supply of workers in a given profession will drive up wages. For example, some professions require more training, education, or talent than others. These will have a smaller labor pool because there will be fewer people who can do the job. The same goes for jobs that most workers would rather avoid, such as morticians. An increase in the demand for labor will also drive up wages. Smith asserts that rapid economic growth will raise wages because employers can afford to hire more workers. As demand for labor grows, employers will offer higher wages in an effort to compete with each other. However, a recession will lower wages. As fewer businesses can afford to hire workers, the demand will decrease, reducing the competition between employers. Short-form note. Many economists have argued for an approach to labor markets that takes into account psychological behaviors besides rational self-interest. For example, workers also take into account personal standards of fairness when deciding if a wage is desirable. They subjectively assess the future outlook of the economy when selecting a career choice. Workers may also minimize the risk of loss by staying in jobs for personal security, even when there's a better option for them out there. Finally, organizing into unions also gives workers much more leverage to push for higher wages. However, it's important to note that these behavioral dimensions don't invalidate the principles of supply and demand, but rather work in tandem with them to shape labor markets. 2. Workers' living conditions. Lastly, Smith explains that wages vary based on the workers' living conditions. Wages must be enough so that workers can furnish themselves with food and housing. Furthermore, there is greater regional variety in the rate of wages than there is for the cost of goods. Smith states that this is because it's easier to transport goods long distances than it is to get people to move away from where they live. You can easily and cheaply transport most goods across long distances, so there isn't likely to be much variety in the price of the same good from one region to the next. Workers, however, are often unable or unwilling to move away from the area where they live or have close social connections. Therefore, workers tend to accept the prevailing local wage rather than constantly moving from town to town in search of better markets. This means that labor markets tend to operate across a smaller geographical radius than markets for goods, which makes it harder to bring different regional wages into a closer state of equality. Short-form note. The differences in wages between geographic areas only get wider when taken to an international scale. Workers in wealthier, developed countries can make much more doing very similar jobs to people in poorer, less developed countries. Writing in Basic Economics, economist Thomas Sowell argues that this is because workers in developed countries are able to generate more value, and therefore their employers can afford to offer higher wages. They're able to generate more value for their employers because they have more tools and materials at their disposal. For example, an accountant working with a computer could generate more value than one working with pencil and paper, even though they both have the same skills. Cost number 2. The rent of land. Smith states that the second factor of the natural price of a good is the rent of land. Every industry has to take place somewhere, and if that land is privately owned, then the goods price will include rent to the land's owner. This is especially true in land-intensive industries like farming, logging, or stone quarrying. However, landlords still must operate with some constraints. If they charge so much as to bankrupt the businesses, then the business on their land will cease and the landlord won't be able to charge any more rent. Short-form note. The rise of remote work has changed the nature of commercial rents. Office spaces have lost much of their value, and commentators have floated a variety of proposals for unused office space. However, some argue that remote work has simply shifted real estate costs from companies to workers, as remote workers tend to spend more on housing than non-remote workers. Cost number 3. Capital. Smith identifies the cost of capital, all of the equipment, materials, and money, outside of wages and rent, required to run a business, as the third factor that influences the natural price of a good. He explains that capital is typically lent to businesses for a profit. Those who own a surplus of capital lend it out to interested businesses out of self-interest, and they'll naturally expect a return on their investment. Therefore, the natural price of the good will include not only the cost of the capital itself but also the profit of the investor. Capital is lent to businesses in a competitive market. When the supply of capital exceeds the demand, capital lenders will have to lower their profit margins to compete with each other. When the demand for capital exceeds the supply, Businesses will compete with each other for investment, and therefore capital lenders will be able to raise their profits. Short-form note: economists support Smith's assessment of competition in capital markets. The more lenders have to compete with each other, the lower the costs of borrowing capital for business. However, it's important to consider that these markets can have a very different impact on businesses of different sizes. When capital markets aren't competitive, the corresponding rise in costs squeezes small and medium-sized businesses out of the market, as only large companies can afford to borrow capital at the higher rates. Smith identifies three key factors that influence the markets for capital: risk to the investor, profit on capital, and changes in supply chains. 1. Risk to the investor. The cost capital adds to the natural price will change from industry to industry depending on the risk to the investor. Smith states that if a business venture has a significant chance of failure, for example, a ship getting lost at sea, then the investors will need a rate of profit on their capital sufficient to recoup potential losses. This will drive up the natural price of capital for goods whose production requires a risk of financial loss. Short-form note: contemporary investment experts generally agree with Smith's assessment of the relationship between risks and rewards. However, they caution investors against assuming that high-risk investments automatically offer high rewards. Instead, they recommend assessing the chance for risk and reward for each investment using historical precedent. Financial analysts measure the historical returns and losses on an investment and then measure the standard deviation to estimate its future potential for risk and reward. 2. Profit on capital. The cost of capital is also going to be influenced by the profit gained by the investor who lends out their capital. Smith states that capital lenders are also guided by their self-interest and invest to gain the most return. However, capital lenders are also competing with each other in a capital market. As such, their ability to profit will be determined by the ratio of supply, capital to lend, and demand, businesses borrowing capital. Much like labor, the profits of capital are impacted by a nation's overall economic growth. However, Smith explains that they have the exact inverse relationship. Strong economic growth results in lower profits on capital, while slow economic growth results in higher profits. During high economic growth, the nation has an excess of circulating capital to invest. This will cause investors to lower their rates of profit in an effort to bid against each other. When economic growth is slow, there is less circulating capital to invest in businesses. This will mean that businesses will have to compete with each other for investors, driving up the profits they're willing to hand over in exchange for capital. Short-form note: the need for businesses to compete with each other for investment can cross-pressure business leaders, as the demands of their shareholders may be in tension with those of their customers. For example, a company that reinvests profits in developing and marketing new products may have a competitive edge when competing with other businesses for customers. However, a company that pays those profits as a dividend to its shareholders will have a competitive edge in attracting capital. This has led some to worry that pressure from investors may lower the competitiveness of businesses in customer markets, which may be more important for a company's long-term success. 3. Changes in supply chains. Recall that capital includes all of the materials and equipment required to run a business. These materials and equipment are also goods that must be purchased at market value and follow their own ratio of supply and demand. Therefore, any change in the price of supplies or equipment will find its way into the natural price of goods. For example, a company making light bulbs would be impacted by changes to the price of glass, metal filaments, or argon gas. Short-form note: to insulate themselves from fluctuations in supply chains, many corporations have adopted a strategy of vertical integration. This occurs when a company buys up its suppliers so that it can generate supplies itself instead of buying them at market rate. For example, a company that makes leather belts might buy its own leather tanning factory or even its own cattle farm to vertically integrate its supply chain. However, business experts are mixed on the overall effectiveness of vertical integration. Some highlight the costs saved, while others emphasize the enormous cost of purchasing suppliers and contend that the costs outweigh the benefits. Part 5. How capital grows a nation's wealth. Lending capital for profit plays an essential role in growing the wealth of nations. Smith identifies two main reasons. First, the self-interest of the lender encourages them to invest in productive labor. Second, the self-interest of the lender also guides them to invest in less developed portions of the economy and help them develop. Reason number 1. Capital naturally seeks productive labor. Smith first contends that capital naturally seeks productive labor that can generate surplus goods. Surplus goods add to a nation's overall wealth because they enter a nation's overall supply of circulating capital. For example, a brickmaker creates bricks all day for a construction project. They make more bricks than the project needs, and the excess bricks are sold to another construction project. The brickmaker increases the national supply of circulating capital, thereby growing the economy. Smith suggests that when capital lenders are free to pursue their self-interest, they'll naturally direct their wealth towards productive labor, which strengthens the nation's economy and produces national wealth. This is because work that generates surplus goods can create greater profit than work that does not. Productive labor and outsourcing. Smith notes that capital markets seek out profitability, businesses with higher margins between costs and revenue. One of the most controversial ways this plays out is in a market preference for outsourcing, the practice of hiring outside contractors at a cheaper rate than it would cost to hire employees. While most businesses outsource some of their functions to outside contractors, outsourcing becomes controversial when manufacturing jobs in industrialized countries are outsourced to developing countries where labor is cheaper. Some argue that this is simply an example of market efficiency, that it's better for total prosperity if businesses are more profitable and goods are cheaper. Others have maintained that governments have a vested interest in protecting manufacturing jobs to distribute income and protect domestic supply chains. Number 2. Capital markets seek out undeveloped industries. Smith also asserts that capital markets grow new sectors of the economy, boosting the national economy as a whole. Recall that the lenders of capital are competing against each other for a chance to lend their capital at profit. Therefore, the more capital that has already been invested in a given industry, the lower the profits for the investors. This is because the supply of capital outweighs the demand. Therefore, the self-interest of the capital lender directs them to seek out industries with less capital investment. This process balances out the distribution of capital, driving investment toward new industries, new regions, and new markets, growing the economy. Short-form note: Smith is largely talking about developing a domestic economy by moving capital from one industry to another. However, in the age of globalization, this same dynamic has led capital investors to seek out emerging markets, capital markets in poorer, developing, or post-Soviet countries where there is supposedly room for rapid economic growth. However, this practice has been controversial. Some tout this development as an opportunity to build prosperity in less developed countries. But critics contend that, in practice, this has benefited wealthy investors at the expense of poorer countries, arguing that unregulated predatory lending has left poorer countries with unpayable debts. Part 6. The effects of trying to regulate markets. Recall that the development of a nation's wealth depends on competitive markets in which participants are free to act in their own self-interest. Throughout the wealth of nations, Smith identifies government policies, often intended to grow a nation's wealth, that actually interfere with this process and slow down economic growth. In this section, we'll explore two market-distorting policies that Smith critiques: restricting international trade and subsidizing industries. Harmful government policy number 1. Restrictions on international trade. Many governments try to grow their nation's wealth by preventing the import of foreign goods that would outcompete domestic manufacturers. Either the country bans importing foreign goods completely, an embargo, or it imposes high taxes on the foreign goods to prevent them from being competitive in domestic markets, tariffs. For example, let's say it's cheaper to produce cheese in Canada than in the U.S. This will allow Canadian cheese producers to offer lower prices than American cheese producers. If the U.S. allows Canadian dairy farmers to export their cheese to the U.S., American customers will start buying Canadian cheese instead of American cheese to save money. This will make it harder for American cheese producers to sell their goods. So to protect the businesses of American dairy farmers, the U.S. either bans Canadian cheese completely, an embargo, or imposes special taxes on Canadian cheese to raise its market price, a tariff. Smith disagrees with restricting international trade for 3 reasons. It incentivizes smuggling, redirects domestic capital towards inefficient industries, and prevents countries from entering into mutually beneficial trade relationships. Unrestricted trade requires strong international relations. Most economists agree with Smith's position that unrestricted international trade benefits the countries involved by growing their economies. However, trade policies are also dependent on mutual international relationships between trading partners for 2 key reasons. 1. Both parties must agree to unrestricted trade. If one country agrees to lower their tariffs but the other country does not, this could benefit the industries in the country with high tariffs while harming the industries in the country without them. Therefore, countries often lower trade barriers through mutual agreements. Furthermore, when one trading partner decides to raise their trade barriers, the other country often reciprocates, instigating a trade war. 2. Economic concerns also intersect with national security concerns. Though Smith states that trade is mutually beneficial, he also concedes that you wouldn't want to trade with a country with which you're currently at war. By benefiting their economy, you'll also be strengthening their military. Many contemporary debates about free trade between economic rivals, specifically between the U.S. and China, revolve around whether to categorize the other country as a trade partner or as a potential threat to national security. 1. Restricting international trade incentivizes smuggling. Smith contends that embargoes and tariffs are ineffective at achieving their goals because they create stronger incentives for smugglers trying to get around the rules. Recall that in any market, the price is determined by the ratio of supply to demand. An embargo has the effect of drastically restricting the supply while leaving the demand unchanged. This will drive up the price, as customers who want the illegal goods will now have to outbid each other to purchase from the diminished supply. The high prices will encourage merchants to pursue their self-interest by smuggling the tariffed or embargoed goods into the country and selling them at exorbitant prices. Short-form note: smuggling poses a problem to economists as transactions are unrecorded. This can distort the data used to determine important economic metrics. Some economists estimate that America's black market accounts for roughly 11 to 12% of the total GDP. Many black market transactions in the U.S. involve evading taxes, but many also involve evading labor laws by paying workers off the books. 2. Restricting international trade misdirects domestic capital. Smith cautions that restricting international trade will slow economic growth by redirecting capital away from efficient industries and toward inefficient ones. If it's cheaper to produce certain goods in another country, then buying those goods from that country will cost less than manufacturing them at home. Domestic consumers and businesses can thus save money by buying these cheaper foreign imports and using their savings to invest in profitable industries at home. Those domestic producers can then put their capital into something that would be more profitable to make in their countries, thereby contributing more to national economic growth than they would have in a less profitable industry. However, by restricting international trade, governments artificially prop up unprofitable industries while making consumers pay a higher price for the goods these industries produce. This results in lower economic growth than if the market had simply directed capital toward the most profitable domestic industries. Short-form note: the pros and cons of international trade continue to be widely debated. Many economists support Smith's position that trade is a net gain for both countries. However, trade deficits have become controversial because even a policy that is a net gain for the nation may still be a loss for workers formerly employed in the sectors that had been protected by trade barriers. Even if a nation would make more total wealth by reinvesting its capital and workforce in a more profitable industry, not all workers may have the skills to smoothly transition to work in those industries. Therefore, some economists recommend that countries need to pair free trade agreements with programs to train workers and help them relocate to new industries. 3. Restricting international trade prevents growth for both countries. Lastly, Smith explains that restricting trade prevents opportunities for both the importing and exporting countries to grow their economies. Recall that the size of the market enables greater specialization of labor. Workers can devote more of their time to focusing on a single task if they have access to the customer base and the supplies to support high levels of production. Thus, by trading with each other, countries are able to access larger markets, supporting greater specialization of labor in each country. Smith also contends that countries don't lose money by buying more goods from another country than they sell to that same country. Money traded for imports is still exchanged for goods, which also add to the nation's overall wealth. Are trade deficits a problem? Economists and policymakers continue to debate the pros and cons of running a trade deficit. Those in favor of trade deficits argue that they are actually a sign of a strong economy. Countries can only import a lot of goods if they have the wealth to purchase them, and therefore wealthier countries can afford to import more than they export. Furthermore, economist Stephanie Kelton, The Deficit Myth, asserts that America's trade deficit is merely the result of a strong currency. Other countries seek out U.S. dollars in exchange for their goods because the U.S. dollar has a high exchange value. This puts the U.S. in a strong position, as the U.S. is the sole supplier of this currency. However, critics worry about the long-term effects of trade deficits. Some maintain that countries that export more goods and import more currency may use their excess wealth to buy up assets in other countries, monopolizing industries and gaining economic leverage in international relations. Others have pointed out specific circumstances in which trade deficits have harmed countries with smaller economies. For example, an overdependence on outside capital can leave a country vulnerable to sudden capital outflows should foreign investors rapidly sell off investments. Harmful government policy number 2. Subsidies. Another restrictive policy Smith identifies is a subsidy. Subsidies are policies in which governments directly give money to a particular industry or business. The goal is to support this industry and encourage growth in this particular sector by lowering the cost of production. This allows companies to sell their goods at a lower price, artificially making the industry more profitable. Smith explains that subsidies misdirect investment capital in 2 ways. First, subsidies move capital directly by collecting it through taxes and giving it to the subsidized industry. This redirects capital by taking it out of the hands of private investors who would otherwise naturally seek out the most productive labor and grow the economy but are instead compelled to invest in the subsidized industry. Second, by artificially making an industry more profitable, subsidies encourage capital investors to prioritize this industry over others. This redirects capital away from industries that would be profitable without the subsidy and therefore away from industries that would grow the nation's wealth more efficiently. Short-form note: governments often use subsidies to give domestic producers a competitive advantage in international trade. For example, if country A subsidizes wheat production, while country B does not, country A's wheat exporters could sell their products at a lower price internationally, undercutting the wheat industry of country B. Therefore, free trade agreements tend to include restrictions on subsidies for exports. In particular, the World Trade Organization prohibits subsidies that increase export performance or disadvantage industries in other member states. Part 7. The proper role of public spending. In general, Smith opposes taxation and public spending. This is because taxation takes capital out of the hands of the private investors who would naturally invest it in the most profitable industries. Therefore, Smith recommends that governments should collect taxes and spend public money only if it's on something that's important for society as a whole and can't be handled better by the free market. Smith contends that only 4 expenditures meet these criteria: defense, justice, education, and infrastructure. Short-form note: Smith does not include welfare for the poor among the important functions of government spending. However, it's important to consider the structure of welfare systems in Smith's time. Welfare for the poor existed throughout 18th century Britain, but as a responsibility of the Church, not the state. Christian churches had cared for the poor in Europe since medieval times, but with an inconsistent, patchwork system. Queen Elizabeth I standardized church welfare systems throughout the UK with the Poor Laws of 1601. Smith discusses the Poor Laws at length in an analysis of parish residency requirements and their impact on labor markets, but he argues neither for nor against the practice of collecting and distributing welfare. State expenditure number 1. Defense. Every country must defend itself from foreign invasions with a standing military. Smith provides 3 arguments for the benefits of public investment in standing armies. Standing militaries in industrialized societies are highly expensive because modern warfare requires implements like cannons, ships, and artillery. Therefore, it's difficult to imagine another funding source that could actually cover the expense and keep the nation well defended against national security threats. Without a standing army, governments will have to move laborers out of their existing professions to fight for the duration of the war. This will disrupt the economy. Many types of work in modern economies don't prepare workers for the profession of soldiering. Therefore, it's better in wartime to have a corps of soldiers that are already trained to fight. Short-form note. In his arguments for the importance of a national military, Smith is specifically responding to debates over whether countries should maintain a standing army during times of peace as well as war. Some countries opted to disband their military forces during peacetime and reconstitute them should war break out. Standing armies were controversial in the 18th century because of their enormous cost and the tendency of soldiers to abuse their power and authority over the population. Smith contends that the practice of reconstituting the army in wartime is sufficient for less economically developed societies, but that an industrial society needs a full-time professional military to defend itself. State expenditure number 2. Justice. Governments have an obligation to provide justice and enforce the laws. Smith cites 2 benefits of having a judiciary funded by the government. The wealthier a society becomes, the higher the incentives to commit property crimes like theft and fraud become because the potential gains of such crimes are so much higher. Therefore, wealthier societies need strong courts and legal systems. Laws ought to be impartial. If judges were paid by the parties involved in the trial, they may be tempted to judge in favor of those that could afford to pay them the most. The relationship between national wealth and property crime. Smith contends that criminals will have stronger incentives to commit property crimes in societies with more wealth to steal. Research on this point appears to be mixed. Studies have found that wealthier countries actually have lower rates of property crime than poorer ones. Many researchers attribute this to stronger law enforcement institutions and more opportunities for legal employment in wealthier nations. However, a growing body of research suggests a correlation between crime and wealth inequality. Societies that concentrate their wealth in fewer hands tend to have more crime. This complements Smith's assessment that self-interest directs property crime. The larger the gap between the rich and poor, the stronger the incentive to bridge that gap with theft. State expenditure number 3. Education. Smith explains that public education provides an important service to society as a whole, as it not only benefits the students but also promotes social harmony and order. Education develops a person's reason. Therefore, an educated person should be able to make decisions more rationally than an uneducated person. Smith asserts that an educated public is less likely to be overtaken by irrational crazes and enthusiasms that might destabilize public order, such as religious or political fanaticism. Therefore, public education improves social order. Short-form note. In his defense of public education, Smith echoes many of the Enlightenment arguments for public education. These views maintained that many social evils were the result of prejudice, superstition, and dogma, and that societies could rid themselves of these problems by cultivating reason in the general population. State expenditure number 4. Transportation infrastructure. Recall that the larger a market is, the more able workers are to specialize their labor and generate greater productivity. Smith contends that everyone in a society benefits from transportation infrastructure that facilitates commerce because this expands the size of the market. Transportation infrastructure includes bridges, roads, and harbors, all of which allow for the easier transportation of goods within a market economy. Short-form note. Many economists agree with Smith's assessment that transportation infrastructure empowers economic growth by allowing goods and people to move more freely. However, there are some important caveats. Because infrastructure has high upfront costs but yields its primary benefits over a long period of time, it's often financed by borrowing money, which, as we'll see, has its downsides. Furthermore, large and complex projects may be vulnerable to inefficiency and corruption. So while infrastructure spending in general has the power to grow a nation's prosperity, individual construction projects still need to be assessed for their potential trade-offs. Part 8. How governments raise revenue. Before governments can spend money on defense, justice, education, or transportation infrastructure, the money needs to come from somewhere. Smith identifies two principal sources of revenue: taxation and borrowing. Revenue source number 1. Taxation. Smith views taxes largely as a necessary evil. He remarks that all taxation takes value out of the hands of private investors, whose self-interest encourages them to invest it in the industries that contribute most effectively to national growth. However, he recognizes that it may be impossible to fund important public works without taxes. Therefore, much of his discussion of tax policy is directed toward finding the least disruptive system of taxation. To explore Smith's ideas on taxation, we'll first look at his general principles for how taxes ought to be collected and assessed. Then we'll examine specific forms of taxation and discuss Smith's analysis of how well they measure up to his guidelines. Guidelines for taxation. Smith outlines 4 guidelines for ethical taxation. These aren't exact tax policies but rather ideals to guide legislators in deciding policy. Taxation is proportionate to income. Smith states that everyone in society ought to pay an equal percentage of their total income. Taxes ought to be predictable. No one should be surprised by how much they're taxed or when. Taxes ought to be collected at convenient times. Tax policy should consider the most convenient times of year for people to pay. Levying and collecting taxes ought to be cost-efficient. Governments need to consider the cost of tallying and collecting taxes when designing tax policies. Smith's guidelines remain influential. Smith scholars maintain that these 4 guidelines continue to provide a foundation for debates about ethical taxation today. His first guideline of proportionality undergirds the principles of payability and benefit, which are still considered in modern tax debates. The principle of payability insists that taxes should be levied on those who can afford to pay them. The principle of benefit maintains that those who benefit most from public infrastructure ought to pay more in proportion to their benefit. For example, someone with a lot of private property will benefit more from the property protections. Smith's ideas about the transparency and predictability of taxes continue to guide debates about specific tax codes that are unclear or applied retroactively. His third principle about tax collection at convenient times has largely been adopted by industrial nations that consistently collect taxes at the same time every year. Lastly, Smith's guideline about limiting the cost of tax collection agencies continues to inspire debate. Some maintain that simplifying tax codes would cut down on the costs of tax collection. Others counter that calls for simplification miss the point that many of the extra features in the tax code are designed for other important goals of taxation policy: preventing evasion, keeping taxes equitable, balancing economic trade-offs, and so on. The difficulty of fairly levying taxes. Smith analyzes 3 common tax policies: taxing land, taxing profits, and taxing wages. In his analysis of tax policies, Smith acknowledges that even though taxes are necessary, each method of taxation has its shortcomings. 1. Taxes on land. Taxing the rent of land provides a challenge for proportionality and cost efficiency. If you simply tax landlords by the area of land, the tax will fall unevenly because not all land is equally productive. Those making less income off their land will then carry a disproportionately high tax burden compared to those making a lot. However, if you tax landlords by the income they make from their rent, this requires more tax agents to collect that information, making it more expensive. Short-form note: in 18th century Britain, much of the government's revenue was derived from land taxes. This was largely because it was easier to know how much land someone owned than how much money they made. However, rather than charging landlords on the rent they collected, the British government opted to charge each landowner based on a valuation of how much they thought the land was worth. This would at least theoretically account for differences in rents without having to actually calculate how much rent someone collected. While this still required a tax collector to assess the value of someone's land, this valuation would likely fluctuate less than the actual rents collected. 2. Taxes on profit. Taxing the profits of businesses and merchants may seem like a good way to tax people evenly based on their income. However, Smith argues that these businesses will raise the prices of their goods to recoup their losses. Therefore, a tax on profits is actually a sales tax on consumers. This makes it harder to tax proportionally, as profits won't really be taxed. Smith also states that taxing profit requires a lot of surveillance and tax agents because you need to know how much profit everyone makes. This makes it harder to be cost-efficient. Furthermore, he asserts that merchants and moneylenders have an easier time hiding their assets than landlords and can therefore evade paying their full share. 3. Taxing wages. Much like the tax on profits, Smith contends that a tax on workers' wages is also a sales tax on consumers. Taxing wages will drive up labor costs for employers. These employers will then try to recoup their costs by raising the price of their goods, thus passing the tax on to their customers. This again makes it difficult to tax everyone's incomes proportionately through a tax on wages. Passing tax burden onto consumers. Much of Smith's analysis of tax policy highlights the ability of businesses to pass tax burdens onto their consumers. However, modern economists suggest that this ability is mediated by the elasticity or inelasticity of demand. Elastic demand changes in response to changes in price. For example, if someone selling Halloween costumes raises their prices too high, customers looking to dress up will make their own costumes instead of buying them. Therefore, it's harder for the companies to pass the costs on to consumers. Inelastic demand occurs when people's willingness to purchase something doesn't respond to changes in price. For example, someone needs a certain medication in order to stay alive. They will pay nearly any cost to get it. Therefore, a tax on medications could be endlessly passed on to consumers. Revenue source number 2. Borrowing. Finally, governments can raise revenue for public spending by borrowing it, either from private lenders, other governments, or their own citizens. Smith maintains that government borrowing is a drain on a nation's economic growth. Because governments will have to pay off this money eventually, borrowed revenue is still paid for by taxation, but in the future. However, it will be paid off at a higher rate because the government must also pay off the lender's profits through interest. Therefore, borrowing money pays for the same public works but redirects more private capital in doing so. Because self-interest directs the efficient investment of private capital, government debt becomes a burden on a nation's economic growth by consuming more of this capital than regular taxation. Short-form note: Smith was writing at a time when Britain had taken on enormous debts to finance its military in the 7 Years' War. While Britain prevailed against their French and Spanish rivals, their national debt had increased to £122 million, about £19 trillion today, $22.8 trillion. Their yearly payments totaled over £4.4 million. To ease the enormous burden of its debt, Britain began increasing taxes on its colonies in the Americas. However, this inflamed tension with the colonies, contributing to the build-up to the American Revolution. Smith concludes The Wealth of Nations by recommending that Britain let go of its American colonies. He contends that they would be of greater benefit to Britain as an equal trade partner that paid for its own defense.